Dr. Jordan Campbell has spent her life walking a tightrope, balancing her brilliance as a physician with the unrelenting need to prove herself in a world that often judges her by everything but her skill. As one of the few Black female doctors at the prestigious Chicago Memorial Hospital, Jordan knows the unspoken rules. Stay focused, work twice as hard, and let her results speak louder than the doubts that surround her. But when Jordan is assigned to the case of John McKinley, a revered community leader battling a rare illness, her carefully constructed world begins to fracture. She is partnered with Dr. Ethan Walker, a quiet but talented new colleague whose unexpected kindness and unwavering support start to chip away at the walls Jordan has built around herself. Their professional bond, however, does not go unnoticed. In the shadows, Dr. Linda Brooks, an ambitious senior attending, begins to spin suspicion into a weapon. She whispers doubts, plants rumors, and turns perception into poison, threatening not just Jordan's reputation, but everything she has worked her entire life to achieve. As the pressure mounts, Jordan faces an impossible choice: distance herself from the only person who sees her for who she truly is, or fight back against the toxic culture that seeks to undermine her. With the hospital board watching, her career on the line, and whispers turning into shouts, Jordan must decide if she's willing to risk it all, to stand in her truth and prove that she belongs. Jordan Campbell stood at her apartment window, sipping coffee from her favorite blue mug, the city of Chicago stretching endlessly before her. Early morning light seeped between buildings, casting soft shadows across her small one-bedroom apartment. Her space was simple yet neat, a quiet haven that reflected who she was: tidy, understated, but resilient. A few family photos were carefully arranged on her modest bookshelf. Her parents at her medical school graduation, her younger brother hugging her tightly as if to shield her from the world. The faint hum of traffic filtered through the glass, grounding Jordan in the reality of another workday. As much as she loved her career, mornings like this carried a familiar heaviness, a tightness in her chest that came from knowing she would walk into an environment that rarely felt like it belonged to her. Jordan had worked hard to earn her place at Chicago Memorial Hospital, one of the most prestigious institutions in the Midwest. Yet no matter how many hours she poured into her patients or how often her instincts proved correct, there were those who still looked at her and saw something other than Dr. Jordan Campbell. She was, to them, a Black woman who had somehow slipped through the cracks into their polished world. It was not always spoken aloud, but it lived in their silences, their glances, and their assumptions. Jordan glanced at the clock. 6:15 She sighed, setting her mug down and slipping into her white coat, the one that felt like both armor and weight. The hospital lobby bustled with the organized chaos of the morning shift change. Nurses hurried by with clipboards, patients sat slumped in chairs, and doctors exchanged curt nods as they passed. Jordan's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she made her way toward the locker room to stow her bag. Her pace was measured, confident, even if her mind often raced ahead. "Morning, Dr. Campbell," a familiar voice called. Jordan turned to see Nurse Rosa Martinez approaching. Rosa had been at Chicago Memorial for over 20 years, and she carried an unshakable calm that Jordan admired. Rosa's warm smile was a small relief in an otherwise unforgiving place. "Morning, Rosa," Jordan said, offering a soft smile in return. "You look ready for war," Rosa teased gently, eyeing Jordan's straight posture and serious expression. "Feels like it most days," Jordan replied with a small chuckle. "How are you holding up?" "Better now that I see you. The morning crowd's already giving me a headache." Rosa handed Jordan a patient file. "You're on the McKinley case, room 412. Jordan's brow lifted slightly. John McKinley. She had heard about the case. An influential community leader recently admitted with a rare illness. He was a man of stature, respected by many, and Jordan knew that this case would require not just skill, but precision. I heard they brought in a new doctor to help with McKinley's treatment plan, Rosa added in a low voice. Someone from St. Mary's. Jordan frowned. New doctors were nothing unusual, but there was always that unspoken tension whenever someone new arrived. Trust had to be earned. Thanks for the heads up, Rosa, Jordan said. On the fourth floor, Jordan took a deep breath before stepping into the room where the morning team briefing had already started. Her presence, as always, drew subtle reactions, glances that flicked her way, voices that lowered a notch. She ignored them, focusing instead on the figure standing by the window, deep in conversation with the attending physician. The new doctor. He was tall, with light brown hair that looked permanently mussed, and a sharp jaw softened only by a faint trace of stubble. His white coat was crisply ironed, and a stethoscope hung loosely around his neck. Jordan caught his name from the attending's introduction. Dr. Ethan Walker. As the briefing concluded, the attending turned toward Jordan and Ethan. Dr. Campbell, Dr. Walker, you'll be partnering on the McKinley case. I trust you two will work seamlessly. Ethan extended a hand toward Jordan, his expression polite but reserved. Ethan Walker, he said simply. Jordan Campbell, she replied, shaking his hand firmly. His grip was steady, and she appreciated that he neither overcompensated nor underestimated her. For a moment, neither said anything. Jordan was used to the awkward pauses, the silent assessments that came when someone new worked with her. But to her surprise, Ethan broke the silence. I read your notes from yesterday's intake, he said quietly as they walked toward the patient's room. You were right to suggest testing for secondary infections. It's a smart call. Jordan blinked, momentarily taken aback. Compliments were rare, and hearing one without a hint of condescension or surprise was almost disarming. She nodded, keeping her voice steady. Thank you. I just followed the symptoms. Ethan gave a small nod of agreement. Good instincts. They entered John McKinley's room together. The man lay in bed, a once powerful figure now softened by illness. His gray hair was thin, and his breathing shallow. Yet his eyes, sharp and observant, flicked to Jordan first, lingering on her white coat before moving to Ethan. Good morning, Mr. McKinley, Jordan said, stepping to the foot of the bed. I'm Dr. Campbell, and this is Dr. Walker. We'll be working together to get you better. McKinley's voice was gravelly but kind. You look like you mean business, Dr. Campbell. I like that. Jordan allowed herself a small smile. We'll do our best. The examination proceeded quietly, with Jordan and Ethan working seamlessly. Ethan handled the technical details of the chart while Jordan spoke directly to McKinley, explaining his symptoms and next steps in plain, compassionate terms. McKinley's eyes softened, and Jordan saw it, the trust forming, fragile but real. Ethan watched her, something shifting in his expression as Jordan wrapped up the conversation. You have a good way with patients, Ethan remarked softly as they exited the room. Thank you, Jordan said, her voice calm. Compliments still felt foreign coming from colleagues, but she accepted it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tests, consultations, and paperwork. Jordan noticed something about Ethan. He was observant but not intrusive, confident yet unassuming. He asked questions that mattered, respected her decisions, and did not try to overshadow her. As evening approached, Jordan found herself in the break room, taking a rare moment to rest. The exhaustion weighed on her shoulders, but the day had been productive, and for that, she was grateful. Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need this, he said, setting 1 cup in front of her. Jordan stared at the coffee, startled. Small gestures like this were rare. Thank you, she said softly, taking a sip. It was exactly how she liked it. Ethan leaned against the counter, his voice thoughtful. It's hard being the new person, he said. I imagine it's even harder when people don't always see you the way they should. Jordan looked at him, her chest tightening. His words were careful, deliberate, and she realized he understood more than she expected. "It comes with the territory," she replied, her tone even. Ethan hesitated, as if weighing his next words. "Well, for what it's worth, I see you. You're a damn good doctor, and you deserve to be here." For a long moment, Jordan said nothing. Unexpected kindness had a way of catching her off guard, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She felt something shift, something small but significant. "Thank you, Dr. Walker," she said quietly. "Ethan," he corrected with a faint smile. Jordan glanced down at her coffee, a smile tugging at her lips. "Then thank you, Ethan." Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the skyline with quiet beauty. In a world that often felt cold and unyielding, this small act of kindness reminded Jordan that not everyone was the enemy, and that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she sometimes felt. Jordan arrived at the hospital early the next morning, her shoulders straight and mind focused. Yesterday's interaction with Ethan had lingered in her thoughts overnight, not because it was earth-shattering, but because of its simplicity. A colleague offering kindness without ulterior motives was a rare occurrence in her professional world. She didn't dwell on it, though. Her career had taught her that people could surprise you, for better or worse. Stepping off the elevator onto the 4th floor, she made her way to the conference room where the morning briefing was underway. Ethan was already there, seated quietly with a pen in hand, eyes scanning the charts. He looked up as she entered, nodding once in acknowledgement. His presence was unobtrusive yet grounding, as if his calm added an invisible anchor to the chaotic energy of the room. Dr. Linda Brooks, the senior attending overseeing the McKinley case, stood at the front of the room. Linda had an edge to her, sharp and calculated, her words always perfectly measured, though her eyes often carried a look of thinly veiled judgment when they landed on Jordan. "Dr. Campbell, Dr. Walker," Linda said briskly, handing them updates on John McKinley's test results. "The patient's numbers are showing slight improvement, but we are far from stable. You'll need to reassess his treatment plan by noon today." "Yes, Dr. Brooks," Jordan replied evenly, her professional mask firmly in place. Linda's gaze lingered a second longer than necessary before she moved on to address the rest of the team. Jordan felt Ethan's eyes flick toward her briefly, but neither said a word. In McKinley's room, Jordan and Ethan worked side by side, reviewing his latest labs and adjusting his care plan. The patient's voice was weak but steady as he spoke to Jordan, a faint twinkle in his eyes as he teased her about being the one really running the show. "You're the brains of this operation, aren't you, Dr. Campbell?" McKinley said with a faint smile, shifting slightly in his bed. Jordan smiled back, her tone warm. "Just doing my best, Mr. McKinley." Ethan chimed in quietly, his voice easygoing. "She is the brains, actually. I'm just here to carry the charts." The comment caught Jordan off guard, drawing a small laugh from both her and McKinley. She glanced at Ethan, surprised by his dry humor. He looked back at her with a subtle smile, and for a moment, the heaviness of the day lifted. When they stepped outside the room, Jordan turned to Ethan. "You know, humor is not a bad tool for a doctor. Patients need that sometimes." Ethan shrugged, a faint grin still playing at the corner of his mouth. "It's part of the job. Besides, I think he likes you better anyway." Jordan's brow lifted. "Why would you say that?" "Because you talk to him like a person," Ethan replied simply. "Some doctors forget how to do that." Jordan felt the weight of his words. It's important. People need to feel seen, especially when they're at their weakest. Her voice softened. "I learned that from my mom. She worked as a nurse for over 30 years, always told me that medicine starts with empathy." Ethan paused for a moment as they stood in the quiet hallway. "She sounds like a good woman." "She was," Jordan said, her smile bittersweet. "She passed a few years ago." "I'm sorry," Ethan said sincerely. Jordan nodded, letting the moment settle. She wasn't one to open up easily, especially at work. But something about Ethan's presence made it feel natural, effortless. Even as the day wore on, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It was subtle, a glance here, a whisper there, but enough to prick at her instincts. She caught Dr. Linda Brooks passing her in the hall later that afternoon, her smile cool and tight. "Everything under control, Dr. Campbell?" Linda asked in a tone that was far from genuine. "Yes, Dr. Brooks. Mr. McKinley's treatment adjustments are going well," Jordan replied evenly. "Good to hear," Linda said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, disapproval, maybe, or something sharper. Jordan watched her walk away, unease pooling in her chest. She had felt this before, that sense of being under scrutiny, of someone waiting for her to stumble. She brushed it off for now. There was too much work to be done to let paranoia take root. By the time evening arrived, the hospital had quieted down. Jordan found herself back in the break room, sipping another cup of coffee, this time lukewarm. Ethan appeared again, carrying a folder under his arm and looking equally exhausted. "Long day," he remarked, leaning against the counter beside her. "Always," Jordan replied with a small sigh. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Do you ever feel like no matter what you do, it's not enough? Like you're constantly having to prove yourself?" Jordan glanced at him, surprised. "Every day," she said softly. "Why?" Ethan stared at the floor for a moment, his voice low. "My family, my dad, mostly expects a lot. The right career, the right friends, the right everything." He paused. "It's like I'm always walking this line, trying not to disappoint anyone." Jordan's chest tightened. She recognized that feeling all too well, the invisible weight of expectations pressing down. "It's exhausting," she said quietly. "Trying to live up to what other people think you should be." "Yeah," Ethan murmured, his expression distant. After a moment, he looked at her. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if it was different?" Jordan gave a small, sad smile. "I used to, but I realized that waiting for the world to change wasn't going to help me. So I stopped waiting." Ethan considered her words for a long moment. "How do you do it? Stay so steady?" Jordan met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "You keep showing up. You let your work speak for itself. And when people doubt you, you prove them wrong. Not for them, but for yourself." Ethan nodded, as though he was turning her words over in his mind. "You're stronger than you look, you know." Jordan smiled faintly, taking the last sip of her coffee. "You're not the first person to tell me that." On her way out of the hospital that night, Jordan was stopped by Nurse Rosa, who was tidying up the nurses' station. Rosa looked up and smiled warmly as Jordan approached. "Heading home, Dr. Campbell?" Rosa asked. "Finally," Jordan replied with a tired smile. Rosa's voice softened. "You're doing good work. Don't let them shake you." Jordan blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Rosa gave her a knowing look. "I've been here long enough to know when someone is trying to stir the pot. Just keep doing what you're doing. You have people who see you, even if they don't always say it." Jordan felt her throat tighten at Rosa's quiet reassurance. "Thank you, Rosa. That means more than you know." Rosa patted her arm gently. "Go get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." As Jordan stepped into the cool night air, Rosa's words stayed with her. "You have people who see you." It was a simple sentiment, but one that cut through the noise of doubt and fear that often lingered at the back of her mind. For so long, Jordan had felt like she was fighting her battles alone. Yet here and there, through small, unexpected moments, she realized that kindness had a way of finding her when she needed it most. Walking to her car, Jordan looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint against the glow of the city, but they were there, small, steady, and quietly enduring. Just like her, Jordan arrived at the hospital the next morning, earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, shrouded in a gray mist that hugged the tall buildings and whispered of rain. She liked moments like these, quiet, when the world felt a little less heavy, and the day had not yet begun demanding more of her than she could give. Her steps echoed softly as she walked through the near-empty lobby, her white coat draped neatly over her arm. She felt steady, yet there was a lingering unease at the back of her mind, Dr. Brooks's watchful gaze from yesterday, the whispers she could not quite catch. The tension was familiar, though no less draining, yet she reminded herself, as she always did, to focus on what mattered, the work. By the time she reached the 4th floor, the hospital was beginning to hum with energy. Nurses moved between rooms, and the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee drifted through the air. Jordan's first stop was John McKinley's room. She pushed the door open quietly, expecting to find him asleep. Instead, his gravelly voice greeted her. "Dr. Campbell, you're up earlier than me today," McKinley said, his face turning toward her with a tired smile. "I like to check on my favorite patients before the rush begins," Jordan replied warmly, moving to his bedside. McKinley chuckled faintly. "Flattery so early in the day? You must want something." Jordan smiled as she checked his vitals. "Just making sure you're behaving? You need rest if we're going to see improvement." McKinley's expression softened. "You know, you remind me of my daughter. She's got that same fire in her. Doesn't let anyone push her around." Jordan paused for a moment, touched by the comparison. "She must be a strong woman." "She is," McKinley replied. "And I see that in you too. It's a rare thing knowing who you are and not letting the world change you." Jordan met his gaze, his words landing deeper than he probably realized. "Thank you, Mr. McKinley. That means a lot." As she turned to leave, McKinley called after her. "Take care of yourself, Dr. Campbell. The world can be unkind to people like us." Jordan nodded, his words lingering in her mind as she stepped into the hallway. She knew exactly what he meant. By mid-morning, Jordan and Ethan were deep in discussion over McKinley's latest labs. The numbers showed small improvements, but his condition remained fragile. They stood side by side at the nurse's station, reviewing the charts. "His oxygen levels are stabilizing, but his kidney function still worries me," Jordan said, her tone focused. Ethan nodded, tapping the chart thoughtfully. "I agree. We should adjust the diuretics, lower the dosage slightly and monitor." Jordan glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You know, for someone who just got here, you're not bad at this." Ethan smirked, his voice light. "I'll take that as high praise, Dr. Campbell." She shook her head, a quiet laugh escaping her. It surprised her how easy it was to work with him. Ethan didn't overstep or challenge her unnecessarily, nor did he patronize her expertise. In a field where collaboration often turned into competition, his quiet steadiness felt like a relief. They made their way to McKinley's room together, and as Ethan stepped ahead to explain the adjustments to McKinley, Jordan lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching. Ethan spoke with clarity, his words careful and reassuring. McKinley nodded as he listened, a small smile of trust tugging at the edges of his mouth. It was a subtle moment, but Jordan noticed it, how Ethan treated people. He carried himself with a quiet respect, an awareness that made him stand apart from others who breezed through rooms like they owned them. As they left the room, Ethan fell into step beside her. "He's lucky to have you, you know," he said casually. Jordan glanced at him. "What makes you say that?" Ethan shrugged, tucking the chart under his arm. "Because you actually care. It shows." Jordan's steps slowed for a moment. Kindness so simple, yet so unexpected, always seemed to catch her off guard. "Well," she said softly, "you're not so bad yourself." Later that day, Ethan caught up with her again as they reviewed more labs at a computer station. They were elbow to elbow, focused and quiet, when Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Jordan frowned slightly, looking up. "Of what?" "Having to prove yourself," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's like, no matter how good you are, Someone's always watching, waiting for you to slip. Jordan's hand stilled over the keyboard. For a long moment, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but tinged with emotion. It's exhausting. Some days, I feel like I have to be twice as good to get half the credit. And if I'm anything less than perfect, it's used against me. Ethan was quiet, his expression thoughtful. It's not fair. It never has been, Jordan replied. But you keep going anyway, because you have to. Ethan studied her for a moment, and when he spoke, his words were careful. I'm sorry, Jordan. I know I can't understand it completely, but I see it. I see you. The words hung between them, quiet but heavy with meaning. Jordan felt something shift inside her, like a wall she didn't know she'd built had begun to crack. Thank you, she said softly. They returned to their work, but the air between them had changed. It was subtle, but it was there, a shared understanding, unspoken, yet powerful. That evening, as Jordan prepared to leave, she found Nurse Rosa waiting for her by the elevators. Long day? Rosa asked, her tone gentle. Always, Jordan replied with a tired smile. Rosa studied her carefully. You've been looking more at ease lately. That new doctor, Ethan Walker, he's a good one, isn't he? Jordan blinked, caught off guard. He is, she admitted. Why? Rosa shrugged. Sometimes people come into your life when you need them most, even if you don't realize it yet. Jordan didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. As the elevator doors opened, Rosa added quietly, and for what it's worth, you don't have to carry everything alone, Jordan. You've got people here who believe in you. The words lingered in Jordan's mind long after she left the hospital. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of proving herself, of pushing back against doubt and bias. It was a lonely road, but Rosa was right. Maybe she did not have to walk it entirely alone. Outside, the sky had darkened. The rain Rosa had predicted finally beginning to fall. Jordan pulled her coat tighter as she walked toward her car, the sound of raindrops tapping softly on the pavement. As she reached for her keys, she noticed Ethan leaning against his car a few spaces away, looking up at the sky with a faint smile. He turned as he heard her approach. Didn't take you for the kind of person who enjoys standing in the rain, Jordan called lightly. Ethan shrugged, his expression soft. Sometimes it's nice. Everything feels quieter. Jordan paused for a moment, watching him. The rain fell steadily, streaking the glow of the streetlights and turning the city into a blur of gold and gray. It felt like the world had slowed down just for them. You should get inside before you catch a cold, she said finally. Ethan grinned. Always the doctor. Jordan shook her head with a smile, turning toward her car. Before she could get in, Ethan called after her. Hey, Jordan? She turned back to face him. I'm glad we're working together, he said simply. Jordan felt her chest tighten. Me too. For a moment they stood there, rain falling softly around them, the city stretching endlessly beyond. It was a fleeting moment, quiet, unspoken, but it held a weight neither of them fully understood yet. As Jordan drove home, she thought of Rosa's words. Sometimes people come into your life when you need them most. For the first time in a long time, Jordan allowed herself to believe it might be true. The hospital's early morning hum was becoming familiar again, a rhythm Jordan could rely on. Her shoes tapped softly against the gleaming tile as she walked toward the fourth floor, her mind already cataloging the day ahead. John McKinley's case was still delicate, but his progress, however slight, offered a thread of hope. Jordan moved through the hallways with practiced grace, exchanging brief nods with nurses and colleagues. She wore her confidence like armor, polished and impenetrable, though her shoulders held a quiet tension. It had been there since yesterday, since Rosa's quiet reassurance and Ethan's words, "I see you." That crack, small but undeniable, had begun to unsettle her. She was used to carrying everything alone, and kindness, while welcome, made her defenses feel thinner. "Good morning, Dr. Campbell." Jordan looked up to find Ethan standing near the nurse's station, holding 2 cups of coffee. His coat was crisp as always, though a small stain on his sleeve suggested the chaos of a missed cap or a rushed sip. He handed 1 cup to her without a word, a small smile softening his face. "Coffee again?" Jordan asked, taking the cup. "Think of it as an early peace offering," he replied lightly. "We've got a long day ahead." Jordan smirked. "I'll take it." They walked together toward McKinley's room, their steps unhurried. Ethan's presence had begun to feel natural, expected even. He never filled silences unnecessarily or pressed her for more than she wanted to give. For that, Jordan was grateful. Inside the room, McKinley sat propped up against his pillows, a newspaper resting on his lap. Though his face was pale and his breath still labored, he managed a faint smile as they entered. "Dr. Campbell, Dr. Walker," he greeted, "2 of my favorite people." "You're looking better this morning, Mr. McKinley," Jordan said, moving to check his vitals. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a bus," McKinley quipped. "But at least it feels like the bus slowed down a bit." Ethan chuckled as he flipped through the chart. "We'll take that as progress." Jordan focused on her exam, her hands gentle and precise. "Your numbers are looking better. We're moving in the right direction." "Good," McKinley said softly, his expression turning serious. "I've got things to do, you know. A whole community out there counting on me." Jordan glanced up at him. She understood the weight in his voice, the pressure of expectations, of being relied on. "You'll get back to them, Mr. McKinley, 1 step at a time." As they left the room, Ethan lingered behind for a moment, sharing a quiet word with McKinley before joining Jordan in the hallway. "He's tough," Ethan said, falling into step beside her. Jordan nodded. "He has to be." Ethan was quiet for a beat, his voice thoughtful when he spoke again. "I think you 2 are more alike than you realize." Jordan shot him a look. "How so?" "You both carry a lot. Like the world expects something from you all the time." Jordan didn't respond immediately. She knew Ethan meant well, but the truth of his words stung. "You get used to it," she said finally, her voice even. "It's part of the job." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if he wanted to say more, but he held back. They reached the nurse's station where Dr. Linda Brooks stood, reviewing a chart with a nurse. Her gaze flicked to Jordan and Ethan, narrowing slightly. "Dr. Campbell, Dr. Walker," Linda said, her voice crisp. "Any updates on McKinley's progress?" Jordan straightened, her tone professional. "His vitals are stabilizing, and we've adjusted his medications to support kidney function. I'll follow up again after his next labs." "Good," Linda replied, though her smile was thin. "Keep me informed." As Jordan turned away, she felt Linda's gaze linger on her back, a sharp edge to it. Something about it made Jordan's chest tighten, but she pushed the feeling aside. There was no room for doubt, not today. The afternoon brought a relentless stream of responsibilities, consultations, rounds, and follow-ups. By the time Jordan finally found a moment to sit, she was drained. She dropped into the worn couch in the break room, closing her eyes for a fleeting second. "Rough day?" Jordan opened her eyes to see Ethan leaning against the doorway, holding his own cup of coffee. His expression was easy, though his eyes betrayed a quiet exhaustion. Jordan exhaled. "Long day. But that's the job." Ethan sat in the chair across from her, his movements unhurried. "You ever take a minute for yourself?" Jordan looked at him, her brow lifting slightly. "Do you?" Ethan grinned faintly. "Touché." Silence settled over them, comfortable and steady. Jordan found herself watching Ethan, studying the lines of his face. He was a good doctor, smart, composed, but there was more to him than what met the eye. The quiet kindness, the way he listened. It was unusual. "Do you miss St. Mary's?" Jordan asked suddenly, surprising herself. Ethan shrugged, his gaze distant. Sometimes. It was familiar, but I needed a change. Why? He hesitated, his thumb tracing the rim of his coffee cup. It's complicated. My family had expectations, big ones. But I realized I wanted something different. I wanted to figure out who I was without them defining it for me. Jordan nodded, understanding more than she cared to admit. That's not easy. No, Ethan agreed, but it's worth it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jordan stared down at her hands, turning his words over in her mind. She had spent so much of her life trying to live up to other people's standards, her teachers, her colleagues, the world at large. But here was someone else carrying a different version of the same weight. It made her feel seen, though she wasn't sure she liked it. The sound of a voice in the hallway broke the silence. Dr. Linda Brooks's sharp tone filtered through the door, though the words were muffled. Jordan sighed and stood, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Break time's over. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. You don't have to carry it all alone, you know. Jordan froze for half a second, her back to him. She swallowed hard before turning back. I'm used to it. Ethan didn't argue, but the look on his face said enough. Jordan left the break room, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Late that evening, Jordan made her way back to McKinley's room for one last check before heading home. The hallway was quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the occasional murmur of a nurse's voice. She paused outside the room, hearing low voices from within. Through the partially open door, she caught Linda's sharp tone. Dr. Walker seems very eager to follow your lead, doesn't he, Mr. McKinley? Almost like you two have some sort of arrangement. Jordan's chest tightened. She pushed the door open, her voice calm but firm. Everything all right in here? Linda turned, her expression unreadable. Just checking on our patient, she said smoothly. Dr. Campbell, you might want to be careful. People are starting to notice. Jordan stiffened, the implications of Linda's words clear. Notice what? Linda smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. That you and Dr. Walker seem very close. McKinley's gaze flicked between the two women, his expression darkening slightly. Jordan swallowed hard, her voice controlled. We're doing our jobs, Dr. Brooks. Of course, Linda replied coolly. Just make sure you're doing what's best for the patient and the hospital. With that, Linda swept out of the room, leaving behind a silence that felt far too heavy. Jordan clenched her fists at her sides, steadying herself before turning back to McKinley. Don't let her get to you, he said quietly. Jordan offered him a faint smile, though her stomach twisted with unease. Get some rest, Mr. McKinley. I'll check on you tomorrow. As she left the room, her mind raced. Linda's words were not a misunderstanding. They were a warning, a threat wrapped in a thin veneer of professionalism. People are starting to notice. And for the first time in a long while, Jordan felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Jordan sat at her desk, staring at the patient files in front of her, though the words refused to settle in her mind. Dr. Linda Brooks's voice from last night echoed in her head, soft but sharp. People are starting to notice. The accusation had been thinly veiled, but Jordan knew exactly what Linda had been implying. It was a dangerous seed planted in fertile soil, one that could easily grow into rumors, then distrust, and eventually doubt about Jordan's professionalism. She'd seen it before. The whispers, the stares, the undermining, it happened so easily. Jordan exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips to her temples. Keep your focus. She reminded herself that this wasn't the first time she'd had to navigate other people's perceptions. It wouldn't be the last. Long night? Jordan looked up to find Ethan standing in the doorway of her small office. He held a cup of coffee in each hand, one of which he extended toward her. Do you ever bring bad coffee? Jordan asked, managing a small smile as she took the cup. Ethan shrugged. Only for people I don't like. The lightness of the exchange was welcome, but Jordan's mind lingered on Linda's words. She studied Ethan for a moment. He looked rested, as composed as always, but she knew that under the surface, he carried his own weight. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" Jordan asked carefully. Ethan frowned, leaning against the doorframe. "Strange how?" Jordan hesitated. She wasn't sure how much to say. "I think someone is watching. Not just me, us." Ethan's expression shifted, his easy demeanor slipping slightly. "Who?" "Dr. Brooks," Jordan replied. "She made a comment last night about you and me being close." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What does that even mean?" Jordan sighed, her voice quieter. "It means she's looking for a way to discredit me. And if she can't attack my work, she'll attack my relationships, my reputation, anything she can." Ethan was silent for a moment, his jaw tightening. "That's ridiculous." "It doesn't matter if it's ridiculous," Jordan said softly. "If people start believing it, that's enough." Ethan stepped fully into the office, his voice firm. "Jordan, we're doing our jobs. Nothing more." She can," Jordan interrupted, looking up at him. "And she will if it helps her get what she wants." Ethan's face softened. He studied her for a long moment, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "What do you want me to do?" Jordan shook her head. "Nothing. Just be careful. If she's watching us, we can't give her anything to use." Ethan nodded slowly, though Jordan could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. Understood. The day dragged on, each hour punctuated by the subtle tension that seemed to follow Jordan wherever she went. She could feel it the way conversations stopped when she walked into a room, the lingering glances when she and Ethan passed each other in the hallway. It was like smoke, invisible but suffocating. At lunchtime, Jordan sat alone in the break room, pushing her salad around with a fork. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by the hollow tightness in her stomach. She hated this feeling, the waiting, the wondering. The door swung open, and Rosa stepped in, her face lighting up when she saw Jordan. "There you are," she said, sitting down across from her. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Jordan managed a weak smile. "It's been a long week." Rosa tilted her head, studying her carefully. "Is this about Dr. Brooks?" Jordan froze, her fork pausing mid-air. "Why would you say that?" Rosa shrugged, her voice calm but knowing. "I've been here long enough to see what's happening. Linda has a habit of going after people she sees as a threat." Jordan swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what happens to those people?" Rosa leaned forward slightly, her expression kind but firm. "Most of them don't fight back. But you're not like most people, are you?" Jordan looked down at her tray, Rosa's words pressing against her carefully constructed walls. She had spent so much of her life avoiding conflict, staying quiet, and letting her work speak for itself. But was that enough? Rosa reached across the table, placing a hand gently over Jordan's. "Listen to me, Dr. Campbell. People like Linda only win when you let them. But you've got something she doesn't, people who believe in you. Don't forget that." Jordan blinked, her throat tightening. She cleared it quickly, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Rosa." Rosa squeezed her hand briefly before standing. "Don't let her get to you, sweetheart. She's not worth it." As Rosa left the room, Jordan sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. People who believe in you. It was strange how simple words could carry so much weight. Later that afternoon, Jordan found herself once again in John McKinley's room, adjusting his IV and reviewing his chart. He had been stable throughout the day, though his energy was clearly fading. "Dr. Campbell," McKinley said, his voice raspy but steady. "You look troubled." Jordan looked up from his chart, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Mr. McKinley. Just a long day." McKinley's sharp eyes studied her carefully. "Don't lie to an old man. I can see when someone's got a storm brewing inside them." Jordan hesitated, then set the chart down with a sigh. "It's nothing for you to worry about." "Humor me," McKinley replied. I may be stuck in this bed, but I've still got a brain. What's on your mind? Jordan sat down in the chair beside his bed, her voice soft. Have you ever felt like no matter what you do, someone's just waiting for you to fail? McKinley chuckled faintly, though the sound quickly turned into a cough. All the time. Comes with the territory when you're trying to make a difference. How do you deal with it? Jordan asked, genuinely curious. McKinley's voice softened. You remember who you are and why you're here? The people who come after you? They're just noise. But the people you help, that's what matters. Jordan stared at him, his words sinking deep into her chest. The people you help, that's what matters. You're a good doctor, Dr. Campbell, McKinley added, his eyes serious. And I don't say that lightly. Don't let anyone make you forget it. Jordan smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Mr. McKinley. At the end of the day, Jordan gathered her things in the locker room, her mind quieter than it had been in hours. McKinley's words had stayed with her, a small beacon of clarity in the chaos. As she turned to leave, she saw Ethan waiting for her by the door. He pushed off the wall as she approached, his expression concerned. Hey, he said softly, how are you holding up? Jordan paused, studying him for a moment. She considered brushing it off, giving him her usual, I'm fine. But instead she said, I'm managing. It's been a rough couple of days. Ethan nodded, his eyes steady. I've got your back, Jordan. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. She wasn't used to hearing that. For so long, she had believed that she had to stand alone to prove her strength. But here was someone offering support without conditions or expectations. Thank you, she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. Anytime. They walked toward the elevator together, their steps quiet. Outside the glass doors, the city lights flickered to life, their glow cutting through the growing darkness. Jordan looked out at the skyline, her thoughts calm for the first time in days. She knew the battle wasn't over. Linda was still watching, still waiting. But Jordan wasn't going to let her win, not without a fight. The people you help, that's what matters. And Jordan Campbell was going to hold on to that. The next morning arrived with heavy clouds pressing down over Chicago. Rain threatened in the distant gray sky, mirroring the pressure Jordan felt deep in her chest. She parked her car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as if she could squeeze her frustration into submission. Focus, she reminded herself. The work matters. As she entered the hospital, the whispers were unmistakable now, subtle but lingering. Like the faint hum of static, nurses exchanged brief glances. Two residents paused mid-conversation when she passed. Jordan straightened her back and held her head high. If she showed cracks, they would widen. At the nurse's station, Ethan was waiting for her, a patient file in hand. Morning, he said, his voice softer than usual. Morning, Jordan replied evenly, though her exhaustion leaked through her tone. Ethan studied her carefully. You okay? I'm fine, she said, brushing past the question. What's the update? Ethan sighed but didn't push. McKinley's vitals were stable overnight, but he's still at risk. Linda wants us to present his full case plan at the noon meeting. Jordan froze. Noon? Why now? She said it's a routine review, Ethan replied using air quotes. His expression darkened. It feels like a setup. Jordan clenched her jaw. Linda was escalating, and Jordan knew exactly what this was, a chance to undermine her publicly, to paint her as incompetent or reckless. It wasn't the first time someone had tried, but it didn't make it easier. I'll prepare the slides, Jordan said, her voice clipped. I'll help, Ethan offered immediately. Jordan glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude passing through her. Thank you. The hours leading up to the noon meeting were a blur of preparation. Jordan and Ethan reviewed every lab, every medication adjustment, every piece of the treatment plan. They were meticulous, leaving no space for Linda to poke holes. Ethan noticed Jordan's hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the charts. "Jordan," he said softly. She didn't look up. "What?" "You're ready. We're ready," he reassured her. "We've done the work. You have nothing to prove." Jordan swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His steady confidence anchored her in the storm. "I know." But deep down, that small voice of doubt whispered, "What if it's not enough?" The conference room was filled by the time Jordan and Ethan arrived. Dr. Linda Brooks stood near the front, her pristine white coat and practiced smile giving her the air of quiet authority. Jordan felt the heat of Linda's gaze as she entered, but she refused to look away. She and Ethan took their seats near the screen. The room buzzed with quiet conversation among doctors, attendings, and hospital leadership. Jordan spotted Rosa near the back, offering a brief, reassuring nod that steadied her. "Let's begin," Linda said, her voice sharp as she called the room to attention. "Dr. Campbell and Dr. Walker will now present the current treatment plan for Mr. John McKinley. Dr. Campbell, the floor is yours." Jordan stood, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She glanced once at Ethan, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She took a deep breath and began. Jordan's voice was clear and steady as she walked the room through McKinley's case. She explained his condition, the reasoning behind each step of their treatment, and the incremental progress they'd seen over the past few days. Ethan clicked through the slides, offering brief input where needed, but he let Jordan take the lead. As she spoke, she saw the expressions of her colleagues begin to shift curiosity, giving way to understanding, and understanding to respect. For a moment, she felt like herself again, confident, composed, in control. Then Linda struck. "Thank you, Dr. Campbell," Linda said smoothly as Jordan finished. "While your plan is certainly thorough, I do have a question." Jordan's spine straightened. "Of course, Dr. Brooks." Linda tilted her head slightly, as if pondering her next words. "Given the recent rumors about your relationship with Dr. Walker, do you feel that your collaboration has remained entirely objective?" The words hit Jordan like a physical blow. The room fell silent, the air thick with discomfort. Jordan's cheeks burned, but she kept her face impassive. "With all due respect, Dr. Brooks," Jordan said evenly, "my focus has always been, and will always be, on the patient. Mr. McKinley's progress speaks for itself." Linda raised an eyebrow, her smile cold. "Of course, but perception matters, Dr. Campbell. I would hate for the board to feel there was bias in his care." Jordan's fists clenched at her sides. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Jordan lifted a hand to stop him. She wouldn't let this spiral. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Brooks," Jordan replied calmly, her voice unwavering. "However, my work has always been based on evidence and professional integrity. I'm confident that the results of Mr. McKinley's care will speak louder than speculation." Linda's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she recovered quickly. "We'll see," she said smoothly. "For now, the board will review the case later this week." Jordan sat down, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel the weight of the room's eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, others with doubt. Ethan leaned toward her, his voice low. "You handled that perfectly." Jordan didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, focusing on the rising hum of conversation as the meeting broke apart. The afternoon passed in a haze. Jordan moved through her rounds, her mind replaying Linda's words on a loop. Perception matters. It didn't matter that her treatment plan had been sound. Linda had found a crack and widened it for everyone to see. She was in the break room hours later, staring blankly at the coffee machine when Ethan walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just poured himself a cup of coffee and stood beside her. Finally, he spoke. "You're not going to let her win, are you?" Jordan exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "She wants me to stumble, to give up. I won't." Ethan turned to look at her, his voice soft but firm. "Good. Because you're the best doctor I've worked with. Don't let her take that from you." Jordan looked at him, something deep and unspoken passing between them. It wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about every person who had ever doubted her, every whisper and sidelong glance she'd endured. She couldn't let them win. "You believe in me?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I do." Jordan nodded, his words settling something inside her. "Then I'll fight." That night, as Jordan left the hospital, the rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall. She walked to her car slowly, letting the cold drops hit her skin. It felt like a cleansing, washing away the frustration and leaving her with nothing but quiet resolve. Her phone buzzed as she sat in her car. It was a message from Rosa. "Hold your head high. You are not alone. See you tomorrow." Rosa. Jordan stared at the words, her throat tightening. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of it all for a brief moment. Tomorrow would be another fight, but she wasn't done yet. "People who believe in you." She repeated those words to herself as the rain drummed softly on the windshield, a steady rhythm that carried her through the dark. The morning light seeped through Jordan's apartment window, pale and uncertain, as though it too was waiting for what the day would bring. She sat at her small dining table, a cup of coffee in her hands, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. The knot in her stomach had settled overnight and refused to budge. She stared at the screen of her laptop, where the details of John McKinley's case were still pulled up. His latest labs were improving. His treatment was working. That should be enough, she thought. But Linda Brooks's words had burrowed deep, turning whispers into something louder, something dangerous. Perception matters. Jordan knew it wasn't fair. She'd done everything right, more than right, but the system didn't care. The rumors Linda had planted would fester, and the hospital board's review at the end of the week would either vindicate her or cast a shadow she might never escape. She closed the laptop with a frustrated sigh and leaned back in her chair. Her mind drifted to Ethan, his quiet encouragement in the break room yesterday. His steady presence. She trusted him, and she knew he believed in her. But trust didn't erase the reality they were both facing. Linda was using their friendship as a weapon. Jordan rubbed her temples, a small voice creeping into her thoughts. What if ending this, distancing myself from him, makes it all go away? The thought made her chest tighten. Ethan had been the first person in years to see her without assumptions or judgment, and she didn't want to lose that. But she also couldn't let him become her weakness. Her phone buzzed, breaking her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Nurse Rosa. "McKinley asking for you first thing this morning. See you soon, Rosa." Jordan exhaled slowly, rose to her feet, and grabbed her coat. Work first. Always work first. The hospital felt colder that day, as though it sensed her unease. Jordan's heels clicked softly against the tiles as she made her way to the 4th floor. The air in the hallways was heavier than usual, conversations quieter. She knew the rumors were spreading. When she arrived at John McKinley's room, she paused in the doorway. The old man sat up in bed, his breathing steadier than it had been days ago. Despite his frailty, there was something solid in the way he looked at her, a quiet strength she admired. "Dr. Campbell," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Jordan smiled faintly and stepped inside. "Never, Mr. McKinley. How are you feeling today?" "Better. I can tell you and Dr. Walker know what you're doing," he replied, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "But you look like you haven't slept in a week. What's going on?" Jordan hesitated, busying herself with his vitals. "Just a long week." "Don't lie to me, young lady," McKinley said firmly. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. Something's weighing on you." Jordan set down her clipboard, her shoulders sinking slightly. For a long moment, she didn't speak. "Sometimes," she said softly, "doing the right thing isn't enough. People still see what they want to see." McKinley's gaze sharpened. "Someone's coming after you, aren't they?" Jordan's lips pressed into a thin line. It's complicated. No, it's not, McKinley replied, his voice steady. You're good at what you do, Dr. Campbell. Anyone with half a brain can see that. But sometimes people get scared when they see someone who's better than them, someone who's strong enough to stand out. Jordan swallowed hard, his words landing deep. It doesn't feel that simple. McKinley studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. Let me tell you something, doctor. My whole life, people tried to tear me down. Called me too loud, too opinionated, too much trouble. And you know what I did? I kept showing up. I kept being too much. Because if I wasn't, who else would fight for the people who couldn't? Jordan looked at him, her throat tightening. And did it get easier? McKinley chuckled softly. No, but it got worth it. The words settled into her chest, something quiet and warm pushing back against the fear she'd carried since Linda's attack. Thank you, Mr. McKinley, Jordan said softly. I needed that. McKinley smiled, his eyes kind. You're welcome. Now go remind them who you are. As Jordan left McKinley's room, she spotted Ethan waiting at the nurse's station, reviewing a file. He looked up when he saw her, offering a small smile that she couldn't quite return. Everything okay? He asked. Jordan hesitated, searching his face. She thought of Linda's accusation, of the whispers, of everything she'd worked for being reduced to nothing more than a rumor. We need to talk, she said quietly. Ethan frowned, but nodded. Come on. He led her to an empty office, the blinds drawn, and closed the door behind them. The silence settled heavily between them as Jordan leaned against the edge of the desk. What's going on? Ethan asked, his voice soft but cautious. Jordan met his gaze, forcing herself to stay steady. Ethan, the more time we spend together, the worse this gets. Linda's already trying to use it against me. Ethan's brow furrowed. This? What do you mean? This, Jordan said, gesturing between them. Whatever this is, she's twisting it into something it's not. Ethan's face fell slightly. Jordan! Ethan, listen, she interrupted, her voice firm but calm. You're a good doctor, and I trust you, but I can't give her ammunition. I can't let her use you to take me down. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression pained. You think putting distance between us will stop her? I think it's the only choice I have, Jordan replied quietly. Ethan shook his head. Jordan, you don't have to fight this alone. I do, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I've always had to. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked at her, his voice quieter when he finally spoke. And what if you're wrong? What if pushing people away doesn't protect you? Jordan swallowed hard, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking. If this is what you need, I'll respect it. But I want you to know something, Jordan. You're not alone. No matter what happens. Jordan's chest ached at his words, but she nodded once. Thank you, Ethan. She turned and left the office before he could say anything else, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jordan buried herself in her work, her movements precise and mechanical. But Ethan's words lingered in her mind. What if pushing people away doesn't protect you? By the time Jordan left the hospital that night, the rain had started again, soft and steady, as if the sky was apologizing. She walked to her car slowly, the cold drops soaking into her coat. She thought of McKinley's words. I kept being too much, because if I wasn't, who else would fight? She thought of Rosa's quiet kindness, of Ethan's unwavering belief in her. And for the first time, she realized that maybe carrying everything alone wasn't a mark of strength. Maybe it was a habit, one she didn't know how to break. Jordan sat in her car, rain tapping gently against the windshield. She stared out at the blurry city lights, her reflection faint in the glass. What if you let people in? The thought sat quietly in her chest. Not yet an answer, but the start of one. Tomorrow, she would show up, because that's what she did. But for the first time in years, she wondered if showing up meant letting others stand beside her. The hospital seemed quieter than usual the next morning, as though the tension of the past few days had settled into its walls, waiting for something to crack. Jordan felt it as soon as she walked through the double doors, a palpable weight that followed her down the hall. She kept her head high, her steps steady, though her chest felt tight. Just keep showing up. It had been her mantra for years through medical school, through her residency, through every whispered doubt and every sideways glance. It would get her through this too. She made her way to the 4th floor, reviewing her plan for the day as she went. John McKinley's condition had stabilized overnight. The treatment plan she and Ethan had built was working, and the numbers proved it. That should be enough. But Linda Brooks's shadow loomed larger now, and the upcoming review by the hospital board felt like a ticking clock in the back of Jordan's mind. When she reached the nurse's station, Rosa looked up from her charting, her expression warm but concerned. "You okay, Dr. Campbell?" Rosa asked softly, her voice just loud enough for Jordan to hear. Jordan nodded, her voice calm. "I'm fine, Rosa. How's Mr. McKinley?" "He's steady, asking for you," Rosa replied. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "And Dr. Walker." Jordan felt a pang in her chest. She hadn't seen Ethan since their conversation the day before, when she'd drawn that quiet line between them. Part of her wanted to believe it was the right choice, that creating distance would protect them both from Linda's scrutiny. But deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. "Thanks, Rosa," Jordan said, giving her a small nod. In McKinley's room, the old man looked up as Jordan entered. Despite his frailty, his sharp gaze immediately caught the tension in her shoulders. "Dr. Campbell," McKinley said warmly. "Still working hard, I see." Jordan smiled faintly as she checked his chart. "Someone has to keep you in line, Mr. McKinley." "Lucky me," McKinley quipped, though his expression turned serious. "So, what's wrong?" Jordan glanced up, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" McKinley snorted softly. "You're good at a lot of things, doctor, but hiding how you feel isn't one of them. Something's eating at you." Jordan hesitated, adjusting his IV line before replying. "It's complicated." "Try me," McKinley said, his tone patient but firm. Jordan sighed, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "You ever feel like no matter what you do, someone's just waiting for you to stumble?" McKinley's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "All the time, but you don't strike me as someone who stumbles easily." "It's not about stumbling," Jordan admitted softly. "It's about perception. It's about people seeing what they want to see and twisting it against you." McKinley studied her carefully, his voice low but steady. "The world loves to test people like you, Dr. Campbell. People who don't fit into the mold they're used to." Jordan looked away, her jaw tight. "And what if I fail?" McKinley chuckled softly, though it turned into a cough. "Then you get back up, and you keep going. You don't let them win. That's all you can do." His words settled into Jordan's chest like a small, steady flame, but before she could respond, the door opened. Ethan stepped in, his presence filling the room in a quiet, grounding way. "Morning, Mr. McKinley," he said with his usual calm, though his gaze flicked briefly to Jordan. "Dr. Walker," McKinley said, his voice brighter. "You two really do make a good team." Jordan glanced at Ethan, but his expression remained unreadable. "We're just here to get you better," she said softly. "And you're doing a fine job," McKinley replied. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ethan's gaze lingered on Jordan for a moment longer than necessary, but neither of them said anything. Instead, they turned their focus back to the work tweaking McKinley's treatment plan and ensuring that every detail was accounted for. It was almost like nothing had changed between them. Almost. Later that afternoon, Jordan found herself reviewing charts in the conference room. Her mind so focused, she barely noticed when Ethan walked in. "Hey," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. Jordan glanced up, her hands pausing over the stack of papers. "Ethan?" He hesitated, looking at her carefully, as though searching for the right words. "Are you sure about this?" Jordan frowned. "About what?" "About pushing me away," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "You think it's going to stop Linda?" Jordan sighed, closing the file she'd been reviewing. "I don't know, Ethan. I'm just trying to protect myself and you. Linda's using this, whatever this is between us, as a weapon. I can't give her more reasons to attack me." Ethan took a step closer, his voice steady. "You think if you're alone, they can't hurt you. But they're already trying, Jordan. You're already in this fight." Jordan stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've fought this fight before, Ethan. I know how it works. If I stumble, it'll be my fault, no matter what the truth is." "But you haven't stumbled," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "You've been doing everything right, Jordan, and you shouldn't have to carry this alone." Jordan looked away, her throat tightening. "I'm used to carrying it alone." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence between them felt heavier than it should have. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I'm not leaving you to fight this by yourself," he said firmly. "Not this time." Jordan looked at him, her walls beginning to crack. "Ethan!" Before she could finish, the door opened abruptly, and Dr. Linda Brooks walked in. "Well," Linda said smoothly, her eyes flicking between them, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Jordan straightened immediately, her face impassive. "Not at all, Dr. Brooks. What can I do for you?" Linda smiled thinly, though the edges of it were sharp. "The board has decided to move up the review of Mr. McKinley's case. They'll be meeting tomorrow morning." Jordan's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," Linda replied, her smile unwavering. "You'll need to present your case and justify your decisions. I trust you'll be prepared." With that, she turned and left the room, the door clicking softly behind her. Jordan felt the walls close in, her breath catching in her chest. Tomorrow. She had less than 24 hours to prepare. Ethan was watching her carefully. "She's trying to rattle you," he said quietly. "Don't let her." Jordan swallowed hard, her mind already racing. "I don't have time for anything else." Ethan stepped closer, his voice firm. "Then we'll do this together." Jordan looked at him, something breaking through the doubt and fear that had settled over her. Ethan wasn't backing down, even when she'd given him every reason to. For the first time in years, Jordan felt the faintest flicker of hope. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do this." Ethan nodded, determination in his gaze. "We've got this, Jordan." That night, as Jordan sat at her kitchen table surrounded by notes, charts, and presentation slides, her phone buzzed with a message. "Rosa, you're stronger than you know. You've got people here who believe in you. Don't forget that." Jordan stared at the message for a long moment before setting her phone down. McKinley's words, Rosa's encouragement, Ethan's unwavering support, they had all started to weave together into something steady, something real. For so long, she had believed that strength meant standing alone. But maybe, just maybe, letting people stand with her wasn't a weakness at all. She looked at her notes again, the weight on her chest beginning to lift. Tomorrow, she would show them exactly who she was. Jordan woke before her alarm, the pale light of dawn creeping through the edges of her curtains. She stared at the ceiling, her heart beating in slow, steady thuds against her chest. The day was here. The board review, the culmination of Linda Brooks's scheming and whispered doubts. For days, Jordan had felt like a boxer backed into a corner, absorbing blows but refusing to fall. Today, she would fight back. Her small apartment was quiet as she moved through her morning routine. She took her time with her coffee, letting its warmth settle her nerves, then stood at her closet, staring at the neat row of pressed clothes. Finally, she chose her sharpest white coat and a deep blue blouse that brought out her confidence. If perception mattered, then today she would show them exactly who she was, unapologetic, prepared, and undeniable. Before leaving, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her reflection stared back tired, yes, but steady. She whispered the words McKinley had said to her days before, as if to seal them in her heart. "You don't let them win." The hospital buzzed with its usual chaos when Jordan arrived, but something felt different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation that followed her from the moment she stepped through the sliding glass doors. Some colleagues looked away quickly as she passed, while others gave her brief, sympathetic nods. Jordan ignored them all. She had work to do. At the nurse's station, Rosa caught her eye, walking over and squeezing Jordan's hand gently. "You ready, Dr. Campbell?" Rosa asked quietly, her voice brimming with encouragement. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jordan replied, managing a small smile. "Good, because you've got this," Rosa said. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words steadied Jordan more than she cared to admit. The board review was scheduled in Conference Room B, a sterile, glass-walled space that seemed designed to unnerve whoever sat at its center. When Jordan arrived, Ethan was already there, pacing the length of the room with a look of quiet determination on his face. He stopped as soon as he saw her. "Morning." "Morning," Jordan replied, setting her laptop on the table and pulling out her notes. Ethan walked over, his voice soft but firm. "You okay?" Jordan glanced at him, searching his face. Despite everything, he had never wavered. She nodded. "I'm ready." Ethan studied her carefully, as if assessing whether she believed it. Then he gave a small nod. "Good, because you've got this, Jordan. The facts are on your side. So am I." "Thank you," she said quietly, her chest tightening. Before either of them could say more, the door opened, and members of the hospital board began filing in. Dr. Linda Brooks entered last, her smile faint and her gaze cool as it swept over Jordan and Ethan. "Let's begin," the board chair announced as they took their seats. Jordan stood, her hands clasped around her clicker as the first slide appeared on the screen. She started with the facts clear, indisputable facts. Jordan walked the room through John McKinley's case, detailing his condition on admission, the diagnosis, and the carefully calculated treatment plan she and Ethan had designed. Each slide reinforced their reasoning. Each lab result showed steady improvement, and every data point was a quiet rebuttal to the doubts Linda had tried to plant. Jordan's voice was calm, unwavering, even as she felt Linda's gaze pressing on her like a weight. She had rehearsed this presentation 100 times in her head, and her confidence built with every word. Finally, she reached the last slide, McKinley's most recent results. "As you can see," Jordan said, gesturing toward the screen, "Mr. McKinley's oxygen levels have stabilized, and his kidney function is beginning to recover. These results demonstrate that the treatment plan we implemented was both appropriate and effective." She turned to the board, meeting each person's gaze. "Our decisions were based on clinical evidence and what was best for the patient, nothing else." The board chair nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Dr. Campbell. That was thorough." Jordan felt a flicker of relief, but it didn't last long. Linda stood, smoothing her coat before she spoke. "Thank you, Dr. Campbell," she said, her tone even but laced with something sharper. "I think we can all agree that the results are promising." However, Jordan's pulse quickened. She knew what was coming. Linda turned toward the board. "We cannot ignore the need for objectivity in patient care. There have been valid concerns about Dr. Campbell's working relationship with Dr. Walker and whether that relationship might have compromised clinical judgment." The room fell silent. Jordan's jaw tightened as she kept her expression neutral, but the sting of Linda's words hit her hard. Before Jordan could respond, Ethan stood. "With all due respect, Dr. Brooks," he said, his voice steady and clear, "those concerns are baseless." All eyes turned to Ethan. Jordan froze, her heart hammering. Ethan continued, his gaze locked on Linda. "Dr. Campbell has been nothing but professional. She has led this case with skill, integrity, and compassion. The results speak for themselves. Mr. McKinley is alive and improving because of her decisions." Linda's expression faltered, but Ethan wasn't done. "If there's anyone in this room questioning her objectivity, I'd ask you to look at the evidence, not rumors. Dr. Campbell deserves your respect, not suspicion." The silence that followed was absolute. Jordan stared at Ethan, her chest tight. He had said what she couldn't, what she hadn't dared to. The board chair cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Thank you, Dr. Walker. I believe we have everything we need to make a decision." Jordan sat down slowly, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. Ethan sank into the chair beside her, his voice low as he whispered, "I told you you're not alone." The afternoon stretched on as Jordan returned to her rounds, the weight of the morning still sitting heavily on her shoulders. The board would deliver their decision soon, but for now, all she could do was wait. As she entered John McKinley's room to check on him, his sharp eyes met hers immediately. "You're walking taller today," he said with a faint smile. Jordan blinked. "What do you mean?" McKinley chuckled. "I can see it. You've decided to stop letting them win." Jordan's lips curved into a small smile, the tension in her chest easing slightly. "Maybe I have." "Good," McKinley replied. "People like you don't back down. That's how you change the world." As the day came to an end, Jordan found herself standing at the large windows on the hospital's ground floor, watching the rain streak down the glass. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Ethan approaching. "They're going to see it," Ethan said softly, stopping beside her. "They're going to see what you're capable of." Jordan looked at him, her voice quiet. "Thank you. For today." Ethan shrugged, though his expression was serious. "You didn't need me to defend you, but I wasn't about to let them tear you down." Jordan nodded, her throat tight. "It meant more than you know." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the hospital a quiet backdrop. Finally, Ethan broke it with a faint smile. "So, I guess we'll see what happens next." Jordan turned back to the rain, her shoulders steady. "Whatever happens, I'm ready." And for the first time, she truly meant it. The air inside the hospital felt different the next morning, lighter somehow, as though the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath. Jordan stepped off the elevator, her white coat crisp, her shoulders square. The tension of the past days hadn't completely lifted, but there was a steadiness in her chest now, a certainty. She moved with quiet determination through the fourth floor, exchanging nods with nurses and staff along the way. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like people were avoiding her gaze. Instead, there were small gestures, subtle smiles, brief acknowledgments that chipped away at the isolation she had been carrying. Rosa was at the nurse's station, her hands organizing a thick stack of patient files. She looked up and smiled warmly as Jordan approached. "Morning, Dr. Campbell," Rosa said, with a hint of pride in her voice. "Morning, Rosa." Jordan's lips curved into a small smile. Rosa leaned in, her voice lowering. "I heard about the meeting yesterday. Word travels fast, you know. People are seeing the truth." Jordan's smile softened, the words settling in her chest like warmth spreading outward. "Thank you," she said quietly. Rosa gave her a knowing look. "I told you. You've got people here who believe in you. Never forget that." Jordan entered John McKinley's room, and his sharp eyes immediately turned toward her, a familiar twinkle in their depths. "Well, well," McKinley said with a faint grin. "You look like someone who just won a battle." Jordan chuckled softly as she checked his chart. "Let's just say I'm still standing." McKinley nodded approvingly, his voice steady despite the wear of his illness. "That's all that matters. The world's full of people who'll try to knock you down, but if you get back up, you win." Jordan looked at him, the weight of his words reaching her. "You were right, about not letting them win." McKinley's smile widened just a fraction. "I've been right about a lot of things lately. One of them being that you're a damn good doctor." "Thank you, Mr. McKinley," Jordan said softly, her voice thick with gratitude. He reached for her hand, his grip frail, but strong enough to leave an impression. "You keep fighting, Dr. Campbell, for yourself and for every patient who needs you." Jordan nodded, squeezing his hand gently before stepping back. "I will." At noon, as Jordan walked through the hospital corridors, she noticed the faint hush of conversations in her wake. The review board's decision was due any moment, and she could feel the anticipation hanging in the air. Yet, for the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. She knew she had done everything right. She had nothing to hide. Just as she reached the nurse's station, Ethan appeared, his expression unreadable as he held a manila envelope in his hands. "Jordan," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Jordan's stomach tightened as she looked at the envelope. "Is that—" Ethan nodded, handing it to her. "The board's decision." For a moment, Jordan hesitated. She stared down at the sealed envelope, its weight feeling both insignificant and overwhelming. Then she took a deep breath, tore it open, and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. Her eyes scanned the words carefully. "The board has reviewed Dr. Campbell's treatment decisions regarding Mr. John McKinley and found them to be clinically sound, demonstrating excellent professional judgment and care." Her shoulders sank with relief as she read the line over and over, making sure it was real. The decision was clear. She was vindicated. She looked up at Ethan, a small, unsteady smile tugging at her lips. "They ruled in my favor." Ethan grinned, a genuine, relieved grin that lit up his face. "I told you, they'd see the truth." Jordan let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "It's finally over." "Not just over," Ethan said, his voice softening. "You won, Jordan." For a moment, the words hung between them, carrying more weight than either of them said aloud. Jordan felt the tension that had gripped her for days begin to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, lighter. Later that afternoon, Jordan stood outside in the hospital's small courtyard, the cool air brushing against her skin. The storm that had lingered over the city for days had finally passed, leaving the sky washed clear and bright. The sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to pause and just breathe. "Dr. Campbell." Jordan turned to see Ethan walking toward her, hands in his coat pockets. He stopped a few feet away, his smile soft and easy. "Escaping the chaos?" he asked. "Just for a minute," Jordan replied, glancing at the sky. "I needed some air." Ethan nodded, stepping closer to stand beside her. "How does it feel, knowing it's over?" Jordan exhaled slowly. "It feels good, but it also feels like there's still work to do." Ethan tilted his head, looking at her. "You don't have to carry all of it by yourself, you know." Jordan looked back at him, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm starting to realize that." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the city a distant hum. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You're not just a good doctor, Jordan. You're one of the best. And you didn't deserve any of this." Jordan met his gaze, her throat tightening. "Thank you for standing up for me, for believing in me." Ethan shrugged, though his expression was serious. "It wasn't hard to believe in you, Jordan. You make it easy." Her chest tightened at the words, but this time it wasn't from fear or frustration. It was something else, something like hope. She glanced back at the hospital, its windows reflecting the same light that now warmed her face. "I spent so long trying to prove myself, she said softly. I thought if I was perfect, if I never made a mistake, they wouldn't find a reason to doubt me. And now? Ethan asked. Jordan turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. Now I know that's not how it works. People will doubt me no matter what I do, but I'm done letting them decide who I am. Ethan smiled, his voice quiet. Good, because you're unstoppable when you're yourself. Jordan shook her head, laughing softly. I'm not unstoppable, Ethan. Close enough, he replied with a grin. They stood there together under the clear sky, two people who had fought their own battles and found something steady in each other's presence. For Jordan, it felt like a small but significant victory, not just over Linda Brooks, but over the years she had spent carrying everything alone. That evening, as Jordan left the hospital, she spotted Rosa waiting at the nurse's station, organizing papers as usual. Heading home, Dr. Campbell? Rosa asked, looking up with a smile. I am, Jordan replied, pausing to meet her gaze. Thank you, Rosa, for everything. Rosa waved her off with a smile. I didn't do much. You did, Jordan said softly. You believed in me when it mattered most. Rosa's face softened, and she nodded. We're all stronger when we stand together, Jordan. Don't forget that. I won't, Jordan replied, her voice steady. A week later, Jordan stood at John McKinley's bedside as he prepared to be discharged. His color had returned, and though he still looked frail, his smile was stronger than ever. You did it, Dr. Campbell, he said warmly. You got me back on my feet. We did it, Jordan corrected, glancing briefly at Ethan, who stood nearby. McKinley chuckled. Fine. Team effort. He paused, his gaze turning serious. Don't forget what I told you, Doctor. You keep showing up, and you keep fighting. I will, Jordan replied softly, her voice steady. McKinley smiled, settling back against his pillows. Good. The world needs people like you. As Jordan walked out of the room, Ethan fell into step beside her, their movements easy and natural. So, he said with a faint smile. What now? Jordan looked ahead, her chin lifted, her steps steady. Now, I keep going. That's what we do. Ethan nodded, his smile widening. Together? Jordan glanced at him, her smile soft but certain. Together. And as they walked down the bright hallway, the light from the windows falling across their shoulders, Jordan felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She had fought. She had endured. And she had won. Jordan's story is one of perseverance, hope, and the strength to keep showing up, even when the world tells you not to. If you connected with her journey, if you believe in the power of resilience and kindness, there are so many more stories to tell. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, heartfelt stories. Together, let's keep shining a light on the stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.